There are millions of podcasts being done all over the world that take on the personalities of their creator. Some bring in thousands of listeners each week. Some bring in large amounts of revenue, while others entertain millions and help sell products. If you're like many podcasters, you want to reach your maximum potential. But how? How do you make your podcast stand out from all the rest? Join Dr. Barrett Matthews as he talks to experts who are doing it on The Productive Podcaster. Hey everybody, welcome to The Productive Podcaster. My name is Dr. Barrett Matthews and I am happy to be here again today. I have a great episode for you today. You're going to love my guest I have coming up for you. But for those of you, if it's your first time joining us on The Productive Podcaster, you're probably wondering, what is this podcast about? Well, The Productive Podcaster is for those of you out there who may be podcasters, or you may be a budding podcaster. You may be wanting to start a podcast, but you just don't know if you should. You don't know if you should talk about your certain area, your subject matter, or you may have questions about the technical side of it, what it is you're doing, or what's going to happen to make your podcast unique. You know, these are questions that pop up with podcasters all the time. So you're no different. Understand that everyone has questions, everyone has different ideas. And my point to you is that there are so many different podcasters out there that you can still be productive just doing what you do. So stop questioning, stop comparing yourself to everyone else, and just be a productive podcaster. Now, the way I like to start off the show is with a segment that we like to call Pros and Cons.
Pros and Cons.
Now, Pros and Cons. Pros and Cons is a fun segment I love to do, because what we like to do for you guys is give you guys some tips to help you with your podcast. Because the pros out there do a lot of these things, and they do them well. And the cons, sometimes there's some cons that go along with doing podcasts as well, just like anything in life. Well, the tip we're going to give you today to help you be a pro is in your speaking, in your dialect. And the thing I want to tell you to do is to loosen your jaw, loosen your lips when you talk, because I want to make sure that when you're talking to people, when you're doing your podcast, that people can understand you, that you're clear, that you come across well. And what you can do is just do a vocal exercise. Just loosen your lips, loosen your jaw. You don't want to have your mouth shut when you're talking like this when you're doing a podcast. You want to make it so that you're open, you're engaging with people. Too many people go around tight-lipped anyway. You don't want to do it on your podcast. You don't want to be mumbling when you talk to people on a podcast, because guess what? You want them to understand you, and you want them to come back to listen to you again. So do some exercises. I don't care if you have to just yawn. If you have to do that, open your mouth up, get your jaws loose, get your lips moving. Do something that's going to help you in your podcasting, that's going to make it so that people want to listen to you. The biggest problem that people have when they lose listeners is because people don't want to listen to them. Now, it may be because of your content. Sometimes it may be because of your personality, but don't let it be because they can't even understand you speaking. Enunciate the words clearly. Make sure that you can do that by exercising your mouth, exercising your throat, exercise your lips, exercise your jaws. Make sure that when you go on to do your podcast, that is the least of your worries, because you know how to do things correctly and you know how to get your message across clearly. So that's the tip for you today on pros and cons. And guess what? I have a fantastic guest coming up for you in a second. So what I want you guys to do is hold on right there, and we'll be right back to The Productive Podcaster right after this message.
You've heard the rumblings. You've even thought of starting your own. But how? Everybody knows podcasting is the fastest and best way to get your message out and grow your business all at once. Although everybody knows this, nobody showed you what to do. Well, Podcast Nation is ready to do all the heavy lifting for you while you just deliver your message and grow. Join the nation and start your podcast today. Text podcast to 929-244-4323 and make them hear your voice.
Do you hear what I hear? That's the sound of your tribe, your audience, your people. That's the sound of your nation. The people who love to hear the sound of your voice as you bring your special message to them in your very own podcast. How do you get it to them? Let us handle that. We're Podcast Nation, and we make sure they hear your voice. Podcast Nation is a full-service podcasting firm that does all the hard work for you so you can be the talent and get your message to your people. Just text podcast to 929-244-4323 and talk to one of our staff on how you can get started with your very own done-for-you podcast. Or just go to podcastnation.com and get started today. That's PODCAST nation.com. Your people are waiting on you. Make them hear your voice. Podcast Nation.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Productive Podcaster. I told you before we went to break that I have a very, very special guest coming up for you. And I'm bringing to you guys Dr. Hamid Elmyar. I'm excited to have him here. He is an MD and an MPH. I have to find out what an MPH is when we get to him. But he is the host of the podcast with Dr. E. And this podcast, he works with world experts on health, education, community development. And he talks about current health challenges and how it affects the world. And he gets and delves into a lot of the knowledge and a lot of the expertise of these people from all over the world. So I don't just bring you local talent here on the Productive Podcaster. I'm bringing you people from all over the world. Dr. Elmyar, welcome. Or should I call you Dr. E?
Oh, you just call me Hamid. That's good.
Oh, you're Hamid? Okay.
I'll be calling you Dr. Barrett or Barrett.
You can call me Barrett. So that's
Barrett, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to be on your show. And
well, I'm glad to have you. I'm honored that you were here. You and I met at a recent seminar, and I'm just glad to have you here on the Productive Podcast. So first of all, I just got to ask you this. The title of your podcast, with Dr. E, I like that. Where did you come up with that?
Well, that's a great question. Honestly, I was looking to share my message, a long time ago with people, with a larger audience, with more than people I know in person. And for that to happen, I never thought about doing it through a podcast. And so I wanted to have that message which comes from me, and then I said I'd better use my name in there. And my last name is Elmyar. It's a little challenging for some people to pronounce it or even spell it because it's spelled differently. I know there's Elmyar, and some people call me Elmyar, Dr. Elmyar, and Elmyar, so I just said maybe it's shorter to just use the initial for my last name, and that's why I call it Dr. E. And with Dr. E, because I wanted not to be confused with some other probably podcasts or other names that are Dr. E. There could be a lot of Dr. E's.
Good point.
So I just was a little creative to use another word before that.
and see, I'm glad you said that, because there are a lot of people out there who do podcasts or who want to do a podcast, and
right.
They're so concerned about, oh, well, that name's already taken. Well, you can put a different spin on it and
right.
still get your name out there.
And to your point, I just should mention that when I say with Dr. E, it's more of a mutual connection. You automatically connect with your audience, with people you're talking to, because it's not something that's coming just only from my side, or it's not all about me. It's all about them. And so we are having a conversation like we are having a conversation now. So that's with Dr. E, meaning that it's a mutual
I love that.
connection.
I love that. Now, what made you pick this particular topic to do a podcast on?
That's another great question, Barrett. So I started this podcast in the wake of COVID-19. As we all know that this pandemic has put the world in a standstill and a lot of challenges. the implications of coronavirus from socioeconomic to, health burden of that across the world is huge. And I've been witnessing and reading news from across the world. Unfortunately, a lot of healthcare providers lost their lives in treating patients, and during this pandemic.
Mhm.
And I originally come from Afghanistan, where I was, I know a lot of physicians there died, unfortunately, due to coronavirus, and across the world. So I was just, thinking about finding a way to help these physicians across the world. And I I was like, maybe I should start a podcast to bring physicians from the US, from other developed countries, European countries, to share their experience, knowledge, and insight with the rest of the world, especially with the developing countries, so that they can learn from the experience and insight of health professionals from the US and other countries. And that's how I started this podcast. And so far, as you said, I had all health professionals, physicians who were mostly specialists, that they were on the show. And they were really great people, amazing people, very humble people that dedicated their time to share their experience and knowledge with the rest of the world. And I
That's
appreciate
amazing. That's really amazing. First of all, that you're able to pull that all together. But and you mentioned something that I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up. You said you set it up in the wake of COVID-19. Has that? Well, first of all, look, the first question is, how has that affected you and your business as well as the podcast? Has it made it easier to do the podcast? But how has it affected your business as well?
Your question is about the coronavirus or the pandemic itself, right?
Yes.
Well, as we know that pandemic has affected all people across the world, regardless of their profession, regardless of their geographical location. And I would say that as a health professional, I was not as badly affected in terms of economically as other people in different other jobs, because I still throughout this pandemic I've been working. I had to be in person, not even from you can't work from home. You have to go to the actual office, and but other than that, being in that environment where you're at the hospital setting or the lab setting or a private practice, it's more risky than other places. Like if you go to a supermarket, you would still be using mask and you would be social distancing, and other people basically are all healthy people that they're coming there potentially. And but when you go as a health professional in a location where you're actually dealing with a lot of pathogens in that environment, accidentally maybe something that you would encounter with, luckily that we have a lot of preventative measures that but again, to the point to your question, it definitely has affected everybody, including the health professionals. The burnout during this pandemic, and a lot of pressure, and then of course this pandemic and the novel coronavirus was new for the healthcare providers as well. And we learned a lot throughout this pandemic and the last 6-7 months. So it was kind of stressful, but overall, luckily we are in a better situation right now.
Yeah. And that's good. I'm glad, because I mean it's a lot of people think that it's gone, but it's still affecting people.
Oh, it's still there, but people have to be cautious and vigilant and
yes,
abide by the public health directives, and listen to the professionals.
Yeah, I have a friend. You and I talked offline. I have a friend, Dr. Jeffrey Mount, he's been doing a lot of videos on social media and so forth, and I tell people the same thing that you're just telling people just now.
Right. Yeah, especially with the flu season coming.
Exactly. Now, I wanted to ask you, because you do something to me that's remarkable, and I just want to talk about this and pat you on the back for it, because your podcast is international.
Right.
There have got to be challenges that come with putting together a podcast, bringing in people from all over the world. to not only to be guests on your show, but even drawing an audience. So how is that working? How do you make that happen?
Well, it's challenging to put a content or for if when you have international audience, because let's say language is one of the challenges. I can't reach as many people as I could in their own certain different languages. If I wanted to put something in let's say in German or in Farsi or in other languages, then it would be specifically for that audience from that country, but other people would not be able to understand or benefit from that. So I was thinking my native language is Farsi, and as I said, like people across the world were suffering from the implications of this pandemic, and I was like, can I put something in Farsi? And then that was a challenge. So if I put it in Farsi, there will be a certain group of people who would learn, but how about people in the US? How about people in Europe? How about people in the rest of the world? Then I chose to do it in English, and as you know, that English is the international language. It's the language of economy. It's the language of science and everything. So people can have a better understanding of what this topic or this podcast is about, and to put something for an international audience, of course, in terms of contents, is not easy too, because my podcast is specifically on health issues, as you know. So, but again, when you come to health issues in developing countries versus in developed countries is different. There's more of these infectious diseases in the developing countries, whereas more chronic diseases and in the heart disease and diabetes and stuff in the developed countries. But again, this coronavirus is something that, regardless of where you are in the world, you suffer like almost equally. But again, so that's something that what the silver lining of this pandemic was that something it's a message for the world that we're all the same, and we have to support each other. So that's why I put this and in my podcast to share it with the rest of the world.
And now, guys, everybody, I'm talking to Dr. Hamid Elmyar, Dr. E, from the podcast with Dr. E. And I mean, I want to ask you this, as far as with the international show that you do, the international podcast, is it difficult to get guests? To get guests to come on, considering you're dealing with people from all over the world, is it difficult to get guests?
That's a good question, Barrett. The guests, honestly, I didn't have any issues with finding guests because of my connections personally and probably naturally. I am a more social, outgoing person. Like I'm good in networking and connections and keeping up with friends. And so I started at a personal level, like just reaching out to people who I knew, because of course in my field, I know people who are in health field, from physicians to other health professionals. Mm-hmm. And I made it a little easier for myself and for my guests to not worry about too much, like this is for international audience, because I connected these dots together. Like I wanted to have a content, something which can be focusing, let's say if I have a guest from the US, focusing on pandemic or any other health issues which is in the US, but then again relating that to the developing countries, where how can they learn from the experience of health professionals here in the US. And that was an interesting point. Actually, it made it more interesting for my guests and for me to find guests who would be interested to share their experience, not only for their own audience or their own country, but internationally.
That's good. I like that. And see, one of the questions you actually answered my next question, which was, what makes your podcast unique? And you just answered it, because that's what does it. And I bring that up because I know there are going to be people who are watching or listening to this that may be asking, how can I separate my podcast from everyone else? Or they may be trying to find out, how do I deal with an international audience or an international podcast? And there are different ways. See, his way may be different from the next person's, but it's his way. And if you think that his way is valuable to you, then definitely take that on. So I do have to ask you though, have you thought about, once we have finally rid ourselves of this pandemic, what you would do with your podcast?
That's a very good question, Barrett. As I said, I started this in the wake of coronavirus and COVID-19, but the ultimate goal is to share is health education, basically. And this will continue. But not specifically, would be limited to health education. Mm-hmm. I mean, about coronavirus, but there are numerous health issues in the world that people are unfortunately suffering. And we are lucky here that in the US, you have, at least comparing to some developing countries, people even don't have access to quality health. They don't even have physicians or doctors in rural areas in some parts. And to share that message, and not only for people or the layperson, but also technically when I bring specialists from the US, they can share their experience from a professional level with other physicians across the world. So there are always topics that we can discuss about. And to answer your question again, it will not be limited to only coronavirus. So I will be focusing on more social determinants of health, more focusing on other aspects of health, because I believe that health is not limited to hospitals and private practice. It has to start from every individual, communities, businesses, and everybody. And for that to happen, we need to raise awareness. We need to have experts and health professionals from all walks of health to see health from different perspectives.
Well, and that leads me to my final question for you, because I will personally be subscribing to your podcast.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that.
Oh, no problem. With Dr. E.
Yeah, of course. I've been enjoying from your podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I literally subscribing as soon as we get off here. So but I want you to tell everyone where they can find your podcast and the name of your podcast again, please.
Right. So the name of my podcast is With Dr. E. And they can find it on pretty much any of these podcast players, from Apple Podcast to Pocket Podcast to Spotify to Radio Public, and you name it. It's there. And easily, it would be just Google With Dr. E, and they will find out. It's on Anchor, and it's all other resources. And one thing I wanted to share with your audience, because, when you're bringing podcasters to productive podcasts, and a lot of in the introduction, in the beginning, you mentioned also to your audience that they're looking for how you brought up, they have to be good to just speak to their audience. Yeah. And I would add to that point to just be yourself also, and share your message, because each one of us, we all have a story. And if a person doesn't have a story, he's not living, or she's not living.
Ooh, I love it.
And one thing I wanted to quote Mel Robbins, and she says that I actually wrote it down, and it was really important to me. Like, I was trying to see that how important this taking action is. She says that start before you are ready. Begin, don't prepare. And that's how I started. I didn't think too much about how am I going to do the podcast. This is my first time I'm doing the podcast. I didn't take any courses, but I did a little bit of research, of course. And so you have to start. You have to take action. Yeah. And what differentiates you from the rest of the population in the world is that taking action.
That's it.
And I would encourage your audience to just take action.
I couldn't have said that better myself. I mean, thank you so much for that. Now, we're going to take a break here, guys, but I'm going to ask Hamid to stick around for a minute because we're coming back with one of my favorite segments of the show. So hang tight. We'll be right back after this.
You've heard the rumblings. You even thought about starting your own. But how? Everybody knows podcasting is the fastest and best way to get your message out and grow your business all at once. Although everybody knows this, nobody showed you what to do. Well, Podcast Nation is ready to do all the heavy lifting for you while you just deliver your message and grow. Join the nation and start your podcast today. Text podcast to 929-244-4323 and make them hear your voice.
Do you hear what I hear? That's the sound of your tribe, your audience, your people. That's the sound of your nation. The people who love to hear the sound of your voice as you bring your special message to them in your very own podcast. How do you get it to them? Let us handle that. We're Podcast Nation, and we make sure they hear your voice. Podcast Nation is a full-service podcasting firm that does all of the hard work for you so that you can be the talent and get your message to your people. Just text podcast to 929-244-4323 and talk to one of our staff on how you can get started with your very own done-for-you podcast. Or go to podcastnation.com and get started today. That's PODCAST nation.com. Your people are waiting on you. Make them hear your voice. Podcast Nation.
Welcome back to the Productive Podcaster. Of course, I'm Dr. Barrett Matthews. You just heard me and my fantastic guest, Dr. Hamid Elmyar. I'm happy that he stuck around with me because we're in the segment that I love. Y'all know I love this segment. It's called PodQuest.
PodQuest.
PodQuest. I like that segment and topic. You know the name.
Yeah, PodQuest. That's the PodQuest is the name of the topic because we have questions from people who either have podcasts or want to do podcasts. And today's question, and guys, if you want to submit a question, just go to our Facebook group, The Productive Podcaster. Real easy to find, The Productive Podcaster. You see that? And just go to the Facebook group and you can just put in your question there. We will make sure that we put it on the show if we haven't already answered it. But here's one for you. The question today is, how do you work with your guests? So, I believe what they're saying is, how do you work with it? How do we get the guests to be on the show? What do we do to get them to be on our show? Hamid, I'm going to let you answer it first, and then I'll chime in after that.
Well, great. Thank you for this question, and Barrett. And this is really an important question. Basically, especially for podcasts that there are different types of podcasts. One is like just you talk, and that's your own. You just yourself. You're talking. You're choosing the topic and sharing it with your audience. But the podcast that I am using and you're using, that format, we have to have a guest on the show. And I kind of mentioned earlier that it hasn't been that challenging for me to get the guests, but it is how you would reach, like personally myself, I would be contacting, depending on the topic that I choose. Let's say last time I talked about about coronavirus and about psychological implications of coronavirus. So I was looking for an expert in clinical psychology, and how would that be possible to find someone. So I didn't know. I knew one person in person that a psychologist, and she wasn't, she didn't have availability at that time that I wanted. And so I have to reach out to other people who I knew, and through them, I found another psychologist. And so this is pretty much through my connections and my own personal network. Obviously, there are so many other ways that other podcasters are reaching out to their guests. there are platforms for podcasters that you can join, get the membership there. You can be a guest on other podcasts. You can be also, you can host, if you're a host, you can look for other guests. And that's another way to approach. Of course, one other way that getting your guests recently that I've been that's how we connected through an event. And because of this coronavirus, of course, almost every event is virtual, and it makes it easier for people to connect. So that's another way. Another event that I attended just a couple days ago, and it was for 3-4 days. It was all for health professionals. So you can find your niche, like what exactly your niche is, or your topic. Then based on that, you can find your guests from so many other ways. Of course, you have to reach out to them to find out their availability, when exactly they are ready, how it fits with your schedule and availability. And you have to share a little bit of your background of your podcast, what it is exactly, if you don't know them or they don't know about you and your podcast. Of course, you have to set up, I personally also reach out to my guests for like a short 15-10 minutes before my podcast. It's either through Zoom or just mostly Zoom for two reasons. One, if I don't know them really like in person, I get to know them. Mm-hmm. Plus I can explain what the podcast is about. Also finding out if there is any technical issues so that we can be more prepared for the actual podcast. And then I reach out to them on that day. And of course I record that. Then it's both audio and video mine, but my podcast is basically audio, but I also share it through YouTube, the video, and for a larger audience. I hope I have answered your question.
Yeah, I think that.
And I wanted to know from yourself, how you do it yourself.
Well, I mean, and you kind of gave the same answer. Really, it's just networking. The way I get guests is I network. Of course, it's like we've been in business for a while, so we already have a network, an organic network. But that's the other thing. The word organic. When I go networking, I don't go. I used a long time ago. I used to go networking to network, to build relationships. I don't do that anymore. I go to places and I organically just talk to people and I build relationships with them. And in building that relationship, then it makes it easier for me to say, hey, would you like to be on my podcast? Because we have a relationship now. And it makes it a lot easier to deal with, because let's face it, if you meet someone and you're just talking business, you're just talking shop, their trust isn't there yet. There's still that element. So you don't know what they're going to say when they come on your podcast. So that's why you're a little apprehensive sometimes about inviting them. But just go through your organic relationships. That's the best way I can think of it. So Dr. E, once again, I want to thank you for joining me here. Dr. Hamid Elmyar, he's a great, great guy. Check out his podcast with Dr. E. Subscribe today. Make sure you check out his podcast. I want to thank you once again for joining me.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Barrett.
And we'll talk very, very soon.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed the talk with, and I hope your audience enjoys the this talk. Of course, they love your podcast.
And they'll love yours as well. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So, guys, we're moving on now to a segment that I love as well. It's my podcast profile. That's right, our podcast profile. Today, I want to profile a podcast that I just started listening to a little bit. It's called Servant of Pod. Servant of Pod by Nick Qua. Nick Qua, I believe he's out of Los Angeles, but Servant of Pod. And what he does is kind of similar to what we do. He focuses on podcasting. And he focuses on different podcasts out there. So check Nick Qua out and Servant of Pod. I think you'll enjoy that podcast. Now, guys, it's time for the segment that is a little near and dear to me. It's my giveaway. I do a giveaway each week, and I'm giving away someone who is in our tribe, who is in the productive podcasting tribe. Just like I said, hey, guys, if you have a question, I told you to go ahead and join the Facebook group, The Productive Podcaster. Once again, The Productive Podcaster. Join the Facebook group. And one of you may get picked for our giveaway. Also, if you have a question about podcasting, put it in that group so we can get to it. We can take a look at it and probably bring it up on the show. But today's giveaway is to Taria Hodge. Taria Hodge, she is going to get an audio copy of my best-selling book, Why Didn't You Get It Done? Talk about productivity. That book will definitely help you get that. You're going to get an audio copy of my book, Why Didn't You Get It Done? So congratulations to you, Taria Hodge, for getting that book. So now, guys, it's time for my favorite segment of the show, my favorite segment, and it is my podcast quote, or as I like to call it, my pod quote. So today, and if you've heard this one before, you're going to hear it again right now, and that is, times of great calamity and confusion have been productive for the greatest mind. The purest ore is produced from the hottest furnace. The brightest thunderbolt is elicited from the darkest storm. And that's by Charles Caleb Colton. That is your productivity podcast quote. Why? Because guess what? There are going to be trials. There are going to be tribulations in putting together your podcast. Everything is not going to be roses and flowers all over the place. It's going to be some trials. There are going to be some ups and downs. There are going to be guests that cancel you at the last minute. There's going to be technological issues. It happens. It happens. But that's how you get stronger. That's how you grow. That's how you become a productive podcaster. Guys, I want to thank you so much for joining me this week. I hope that you will join me again. I definitely want to thank my guests for joining me, and I want you guys to make sure you subscribe to my podcast as well as his podcast. And I'll see you guys next week. As I always say, don't just settle for being awesome. Set your goal from all to all them all. And take action, guys. I'll see you next week on the Productive Podcaster. Thank you for joining us on the Productive Podcaster. Be sure to join us next time for another great show. We welcome your engagement, so make sure you participate by joining the Productive Podcaster Facebook group and chime in. Also, share the Productive Podcaster with some of your friends right now. If you have a podcast and you're looking for guests, or if you would like to be a guest on a podcast, join our podcast exchange at www.podcastworlddirectory.com. We'll see you next time.